The sun did not rise in the Red Rock Canyon. It bled. It seeped over the jagged eastern cliffs first, a thin, raw line of crimson that slowly spilled down the stone faces, turning the ancient sandstone from deep purple to a fiery orange. The light brought no warmth, not yet. It only brought a stark, unforgiving clarity to the landscape, a world of rock and sand, of hardy juniper and the skeletal remains of cholla cactus. Deep within this brutal masterpiece of nature, nestled in a crease of the canyon wall where a trickle of a spring gave life to a handful of cottonwood trees, stood a log cabin. It was not a welcoming sight. It was a structure built of necessity, hewn from the land with an axe and stubbornness. The logs were thick, chinked with mud and rock, and the roof was a heavy thatch of sod and timber, designed to withstand the crushing weight of winter snow and the searing heat of summer. Smoke, pale and thin like a departing spirit, curled from a stone chimney, the only sign of life for miles in any direction. This was the domain of Takakoda. He sat on a simple three-legged stool just outside the cabin's single doorway, a steaming tin cup of bitter coffee held in his hands. He was a man carved from the same material as the canyon itself. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, the skin weathered to the texture of old leather, creased by the sun and etched with sorrows that ran deeper than the lines around his eyes. His hair, still thick and black as a raven's wing, was tied back with a simple leather thong. He was still, utterly still, with the kind of predatory patience that belonged to the mountain lion or the hawk. He was a part of this place, not just a resident in it. Time had once moved differently for him. It had been measured in seasons of joy, in the laughter of his wife, Nita, and the small, running feet of his son, Chaitan. It had been marked by the rhythm of the tribe, by dances and ceremonies, by the shared hunts and the collective strength of his people. That was a lifetime ago. That was before the world had been torn apart by fire and steel, before the coughing sickness had stolen what the fighting had not. Now, time was measured by the sun's slow crawl across the sky, by the ache in his bones that foretold a change in weather, by the gnawing emptiness in his gut that no amount of food could ever fill. He had come here, to this isolated canyon, not to live, but to stop dying. He had learned the cruelest lesson the world could teach, that to love was to open the door to loss. And the pain of that loss was a fire that burned everything to ash, leaving only the hollowed-out shell of a man behind. He had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, each log a testament to his will to be alone. The walls were thick enough to keep out the winter winds, and he had hoped, thick enough to keep out the ghosts. But ghosts were not hindered by wood and mud. They were in the whisper of the wind through the pinyon pines, in the flicker of the firelight against the wall, in the empty space on the sleeping pallet beside his own. Nita's ghost was the scent of wild sage that sometimes drifted on the breeze for no reason. Chaitan's was the echo of a child's shout he sometimes thought he heard in the cry of a circling hawk. So he had hardened himself. He had walled off his heart as surely as he had walled his cabin. He did not trust the world of men with its greedy towns and its broken treaties. And he especially did not trust women. He had seen their softness as a source of unimaginable strength when he was with Nita. But now he saw it only as a vulnerability, a gateway to the kind of pain he would rather die than feel again. A woman brought light and warmth. Yes, but when that light was extinguished, the darkness that followed was absolute. He would live in the twilight. Thank you very much. It was safer there. A sharp, piercing cry from above drew his gaze upward. A red-tailed hawk soared on an updraft, a dark silhouette against the brilliant blue of the morning sky. It circled once, twice, then folded its wings and plunged into the brush on the far side of the creek. A moment later, it rose again, a small snake dangling from its talons, life and death, swift and without sentiment. That was the law of the canyon. It was a law Takakoda understood. He had lived by it as a warrior, and he lived by it now as a hermit. He finished his coffee, the grounds gritty at the bottom of the cup, and rose. His movements were fluid, economical, betraying the warrior he had once been. The day's chores awaited. There was wood to split, snares to check, the small patch of corn and squash to tend. His life was a litany of simple, repetitive tasks that kept his body occupied and his mind from wandering too far down the dark paths of memory. He worked through the morning, the rhythmic thud of his axe echoing off the canyon walls. The sun climbed higher, and the air grew warmer, shimmering above the dusty ground. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his eyes scanning the narrow track that led out of his small valley and toward the distant, hazy plains. It was a path rarely traveled. Only one man came this way with any regularity, Jedediah, an old, grizzled trapper who valued his privacy as much as Takakota did. Jedediah traded salt, flour, and coffee for well-cured pelts and news, if it could be called that, from the world beyond the canyon. It was Jedediah who had, a week ago, been the reluctant bearer of Takakota's will. The memory was as clear as the air around him. The old trapper had been sitting where Takakota had sat this morning, nursing a cup of coffee. "Winter's coming on early," Jedediah had grunted, his voice like rocks grinding together. "Feel it in my joints. It'll be a bad one." Takakota had merely nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. He felt it too, the ache in his shoulder. Where a soldier's bullet had lodged itself decades ago was a more reliable almanac than any in print. A bad winter meant more work, more hunting, more wood chopping, more time spent just to stay alive. And he was not as young as he once was. The strength that had once seemed limitless now had a bottom, and he was beginning to feel it. For days, a thought had been circling in his mind, a thought he had dismissed again and again as a weakness, a betrayal of his vow of solitude. But survival was a pragmatic master. It cared little for vows made to ghosts. He had looked at Jedediah, the first man he had spoken more than 10 words to in a season. "I have need of something," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. Jedediah raised a bushy eyebrow. "If it's whiskey, I'm running low." "No." Takakota's jaw tightened. He felt a profound sense of shame in what he was about to ask, as if he were admitting defeat. "I need help. For the winter." The trapper stared at him, his surprise evident. "Help you ain't needed help since you first put this place up. The work is too much for one man. If the winter is as you say," he forced the next words out, the taste of them like ash in his mouth, "I need someone to cook, to keep the cabin." Jedediah's eyes widened slightly. "You mean a woman?" It wasn't a question. Takakota's expression hardened into a mask of stone. "I mean a cook," he corrected him sharply. "Someone to manage the fire, the food, the inside work. It would free my hands for hunting." The old trapper stroked his beard, a shrewd look in his pale eyes. He understood the unspoken. He saw the deep, abiding loneliness in the Apache, even if the man himself would never admit it. But he was wise enough not to say so. "There's folks in Harmony Creek who might be looking for work," he'd said slowly. "Hard up folks. The town ain't exactly flowing with milk and honey. But to come all the way out here, to work for—" He trailed off, but the word hung in the air between them, Apache *. Harmony Creek was a dusty collection of clapboard buildings that clung to the edge of the plains like a scab. It was a place of suspicious glances, muttered words, and deep-seated prejudice. The people there saw Takakota not as a man seeking peace, but as a relic of a bloody past, something to be feared and hated. "Spread the word," Takakota had commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I will pay in pelts, good ones, beaver and fox, enough to see a person through the winter and then some. Make the terms clear." He had met Jedediah's gaze, his own eyes burning with a cold fire. "They cook, they clean. Nothing more. When the spring thaw comes, they are gone." Jedediah had held his gaze for a long moment, then given a slow, deliberate nod. "I'll put the word out." Now, a week later, Takakota found himself watching the trail with a feeling he couldn't name. It was a knot of anxiety and resentment twisting in his gut. He had invited a stranger into his sanctuary. He had compromised his solitude. He imagined the presence of another person in his small cabin, their sounds, their smells, their very existence disrupting the quiet order he had so carefully constructed. He almost hoped no one would come. It would be a hard winter. But he had survived hard winters before. He could do it again. The thought of a woman's presence was the most unsettling of all. A woman would try to fill the silence. She would try to smooth the rough edges of his life, to hang a curtain in the window, to arrange things just so. She would bring with her the ghost of Nita, and that he could not bear. He had hired a cook, a pair of hands. He had not bargained for a heart, and he would not tolerate one not his and not hers. As the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp, short shadows on the canyon floor, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision caught his eye. It was far down the trail, a small figure, indistinct in the heat haze. Not Jedediah. The trapper walked with a heavy, lumbering gait. This figure was smaller, and it moved with a determined, steady pace. Takakota's hand went instinctively to the hunting knife at his belt. He stood slowly, every muscle tensed, and retreated into the shadows of the cabin doorway, becoming one with the darkness within. From there, he watched, his eyes narrowed, as the figure drew closer. It was a woman. She was leading a tired-looking mule laden with a few meager bundles. She was alone. As she came nearer, he could see she was young, perhaps barely out of her girlhood. She wore a simple, faded calico dress and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her from the punishing sun. He felt a surge of anger, hot and irrational. Of all the people Harmony Creek could have sent, they sent this, a girl. What would a girl know of hardship, of the biting cold and the profound silence of a canyon winter? She would last a week before running back to the relative safety of town, crying about the loneliness and the hard work. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, her eyes on the cabin. She looked tired, her face smudged with dust. But there was a resilience in the set of her shoulders, a quiet strength in her posture that he had not expected. She did not seem frightened, only wary. Her gaze swept over the cabin, the woodpile, the creek, taking in everything with an observant stillness that reminded him, uncomfortably, of himself. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The canyon held its breath. The only sounds were the buzz of insects and the soft gurgle of the creek. Takakota remained in the shadows, a silent, unseen judge. He had made a mistake. He would send her away. He would tell her the position was filled, that he had changed his mind. He would face the winter alone, as he was meant to. But then the wind shifted, carrying a scent to him. It wasn't the cloying perfume of the women in town. It was the simple, clean scent of soap, dust, and determination. And under it all, something else. Something he hadn't known he'd missed until this very moment, the faint, warm, living scent of another human being. It did not comfort him. It terrified him, because it was the first crack in the wall he had built around his heart. A very small crack, almost invisible, but a crack nonetheless. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was how the pain always began, not with a cannon blast, but with a whisper. For a long moment, the world consisted only of the space between them. The sun beat down on the woman in the clearing, while the man remained a figure of shadow and menace in the doorway. She did not call out. She simply stood, her hand resting on the neck of her weary mule, and waited. It was a posture of profound patience, the kind born not of tranquility, but of having no other choice. Finally, he moved. Takakota stepped out of the cabin, emerging from the darkness into the harsh, revealing light. He was taller than she had expected, broad in the shoulder, with a severe economy to his movements that spoke of contained power. He did not walk so much as flow over the ground, silent and deliberate. He stopped 10 paces from her, his face an unreadable mask of weathered stone, his eyes dark and piercing. "Go back," he said. The words were not loud, but they carried the weight of the canyon walls, a command as absolute as a rock slide. Elena swallowed, her throat dry with dust and fear. But she had walked for 2 days to get here, her mother's funeral still a fresh wound in her heart. The leering whispers of the men in Harmony Creek, a more immediate threat than this silent mountain. There was nothing to go back to. "Jedediah sent me," she said, her voice quiet but clear, without a tremor. "He said you needed a cook for the winter." Takakota's gaze swept over her, a slow, dismissive appraisal. He saw a slip of a girl, too young, too slight for the brutal work a winter in this place demanded. He saw the gentle curve of her jaw, the dark braid of hair that fell over her shoulder, and the storm of anger and resentment rose in him again. She was everything he had sworn to live without. "Jedediah was mistaken," he said, his tone final. "I have no need of you." He expected her to cry, to plead, or to turn and flee. She did none of those things. Her chin lifted a fraction. Her eyes, the color of dark honey, met his directly. In them, he saw no fear. He saw exhaustion. Yes, and a deep, settled sadness, but beneath it was a flicker of something else. A hard, resilient core, the look of a survivor. "There is no one else," she said simply. "No one else was willing to come, and I cannot stay there." She did not need to elaborate. The world was full of places a lone woman could not stay. His eyes fell to her hands, which were clasped on the mule's lead rope. They were not the soft, useless hands of a town girl. They were slender, yes, but the palms were calloused, and there were small, faded scars across the knuckles. These were hands that knew work, hard, thankless work. He looked back at her face, at the determined set of her mouth. He had sought a pair of hands, nothing more. A functional, uncomplaining tool. Perhaps this was it, just in a package he had not anticipated. His pragmatic mind warred with the raw instinct to guard his solitude. The winter would be long. The ache in his shoulder was a dull, constant throb. Survival did not care for sentiment. He was silent for a long time, the hawk circling high above them, the only witness to the negotiation. At last, he gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Unload your animal. There is water in the creek." Relief, so potent it almost buckled her knees, washed over Elena. She murmured a quiet, "Thank you," and moved to unfasten the ropes holding her meager possessions onto the mule's back. "I am not offering you comfort." Takakota's voice cut through the air, sharp as a shard of flint. She froze, turning to face him. He took a step closer, and now she could see the grief carved into the lines of his face, the immense, desolate emptiness in his eyes. "You are here for one purpose. You will cook. You will keep the cabin clean. You will sleep by the hearth. You will not touch my belongings. You will not speak to me unless I speak to you first. When the snows melt in the spring, you will leave. Is that understood?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. Nothing more. The finality of it hung between them, a wall of ice. This was not an offer of shelter. It was a contract for labor, a transaction stripped of all humanity. For Elena, who had just lost the only warmth she had ever known, it was a cold and bitter draft, but it was also a lifeline. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. With that, he turned his back on her and went inside the cabin, leaving her alone in the oppressive heat of the sun. The cabin, when she finally entered, was even starker on the inside. It was a single room, dominated by a large stone hearth at one end. A simple pallet of furs lay on a raised wooden platform, his bed. A rough-hewn table with one stool stood in the center. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke. old leather, and a deep, unshakable loneliness. It was a man's space, purely functional, devoid of any softness or color, a burrow, a tomb. As she set down her bedroll and the small wooden box that held her mother's last possessions, a rosary, a worn cookbook, a silver locket, the weight of the past few weeks descended upon her. She could still feel the damp chill of the church, smell the cloying incense mingling with the scent of fresh-dug earth. Her mother, Maria, had been a gentle soul, a woman who had faced a life of prejudice for loving a man from the wrong side of the border, and for raising the daughter he'd left behind. She had taught Elena to cook, to sew, and to endure. Dignity, *Mia*, she would say, is a treasure no one can steal from you. But dignity was a cold comfort in Harmony Creek after her mother was gone. The town's minister spoke of charity, but his wife looked at Elena as if she were a carrier of disease. Mr. Abernathy, the portly owner of the general store, let his hand linger on hers for too long when she paid for flour. The other women whispered behind their hands about the half-breed girl, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was an outsider, a problem to be solved, and she knew the kind of solutions men like Abernathy offered to lone, penniless women. When she heard Jedediah's quiet inquiry about a job in the mountains, a job no one else wanted, working for a man everyone feared, it had felt less like a choice and more like a divine, if terrifying, intervention. This silent, brooding Apache might be dangerous, but she sensed his danger was an honest one, worn on the outside like a cloak. The danger in town was hidden, smiling, and rotten to the core. Her first act was to build up the fire. The embers in the hearth were dying, sullen and gray. Takakota, it seemed, used fire only when he needed it for a specific task. Elena, taught by her mother that the hearth was the heart of the home, gently coaxed the embers back to life. She added small, dry pieces of kindling, then larger logs, until a steady, cheerful blaze crackled in the fireplace, pushing back the shadows and lending a warm, flickering light to the grim interior. The room was still a cage, but now it was a warmer one. Takakota watched her from his stool in the corner, his face impassive, but his eyes missing nothing. He watched as she took a side of rabbit he had hanging from the rafters and, with a practiced efficiency, began to prepare it. He was used to roasting his meat directly over the fire, tearing it from the bone, a crude and solitary act. Elena, however, found his one dented pot, scrubbed it clean in the creek with sand until it shone, and began to make a stew. She added wild onions and some tough, edible roots she had gathered on her walk up the canyon. Soon, an aroma began to fill the cabin that was entirely alien to it. It was rich and savory, a smell of nourishment, of care. It was the smell of a home. The scent disturbed him more than her presence. It was an unwelcome ghost, stirring memories of Nita humming by the fire, of Chayton begging for a taste from the pot. He felt a muscle in his jaw clench. He had survived on dried meat and coffee for years. He did not need this. He did not want it. When the stew was ready, Elena ladled a portion into a wooden bowl for him and one for herself. She placed his on the table and retreated with hers to the far side of the hearth, sitting on her bedroll, making herself as small as possible. The silence as they ate was thick and heavy. Takakota took a reluctant spoonful. The flavor was astounding. It was hot, rich, and deeply satisfying. The meat was tender, the broth savory. It warmed him from the inside out, a sensation so long forgotten it felt like a betrayal. He ate every last drop, his movements stiff and angry, as if the food itself were an enemy. He set the bowl down with a loud click, but said nothing. His clean bowl was the only thanks she would get, and she seemed to expect no more. Over the next few days, a quiet, unspoken rhythm established itself. Takakota would rise before dawn and leave to hunt or check his traps. Elena would wake, tend the fire, fetch water, and prepare food. She was a silent, efficient presence. She cleaned the cabin with a fierce, quiet energy, sweeping the packed earth floor, wiping down the single table. She found a piece of clean, white flour sack in her belongings and, after a moment's hesitation, hung it over the single, glassless window opening. The effect was immediate. The harsh, direct sunlight was transformed into a soft, diffused glow, making the small space feel less like a cave. Takakota noticed it the moment he returned that afternoon. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the simple piece of cloth. It was such a small thing, yet it changed everything. It was a woman's touch, a domestic act, an attempt to create not just a shelter, but a home. He felt a flare of pure, unadulterated fury. He strode over to the window, his hand outstretched to rip the offending cloth down. His fingers brushed against the fabric. It was soft. He froze. A memory, sharp and vivid as a lightning strike, pierced the fog of his grief. Nita, laughing, hanging a brightly painted deer hide over the entrance to their lodge. Asterisk, to keep the dust out. My love. Asterisk, she had said, her eyes dancing. Asterisk, and to keep the happiness in. Asterisk. The pain of the memory was so intense it stole his breath. He snatched his hand back as if burned. He turned and glared at Elena, who was watching him from the hearth, her expression calm, her hands still. He wanted to yell at her, to tell her to take it down, to remind her of their agreement. Nothing more. No curtains, no softness, no memories. But the words died in his throat. What could he say that a piece of cloth had undone him, that the soft light reminded him of everything he had lost? It would be an admission of a weakness so profound he could not even give it voice. He was Takakota, the warrior, the survivor. He was not a man to be defeated by a flour sack. Without a word, he turned, grabbed his axe, and went back outside, where he began to split firewood with a savage, desperate force. Each blow of the axe an attempt to shatter the feelings that were rising up within him. He was annoyed. He was furious. But as he worked, the scent of a fresh pot of coffee drifted from the cabin, and despite himself, he could not deny the truth. The cabin was warmer, the food was better, the light was softer. The crushing weight of his solitary existence had been eased, just slightly. This woman, Elena, had followed his rules to the letter. She did not speak, she did not touch his things, she kept to herself. But her very presence was a rebellion. She was changing his world not through words or actions, but simply by existing within it. She was waking the sleeping parts of his soul, and he did not know if he was strong enough to kill them a second time. The days that followed fell into a pattern of profound and deliberate silence. It was a silence as vast and overwhelming as the canyon itself. A third presence in the small cabin. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the shortening of the days and the deepening chill in the wind that keened through the pines. Autumn painted the leaves of the few cottonwood trees by the creek in strokes of brilliant, dying gold, a final flare of life before the long white sleep of winter. Takakota remained a creature of distance and shadow. He would spend his days away from the cabin, hunting with a renewed, almost feverish intensity, as if his sheer physical exertion could ward off the unsettling comfort that had taken root in his home. When he was there, he was a thundercloud contained within the four walls, his presence heavy, his silence a palpable force. He watched Elena constantly. He watched the deft, efficient way her hands kneaded dough for flatbread. He watched the steady line of her back as she bent over the hearth. He watched how she never wasted a single scrap of food, how she mended the small tears in her dress with tiny, neat stitches. He told himself he was watching for weakness, for a sign that she would break under the strain of the isolation and the hard work, but he found none. She was as quiet and resilient as the juniper trees that clung to the rocky cliffs. She did not complain. She did not pry. She did not fill the silence with the meaningless chatter he had expected. She simply existed, a steady, quiet flame in the cold emptiness of his life. This frustrated him more than any defiance could have. He had built his world on the principle of harsh, Spartan survival. Her quiet competence, her ability to create pockets of warmth and nourishment within that world, felt like a judgment on the hollow life he had chosen. For her part, Elena navigated his moods as a skilled boatman navigates a treacherous river. She learned the geography of his silence. There was the angry silence, when he would return empty-handed from a hunt, his jaw set like granite. There was the sorrowful silence, when she would find him staring into the fire, his eyes seeing things 1,000 miles and 1,000 years away. And there was the watchful silence, the one that made the hair on her arms stand up, when she felt his gaze on her, analytical and cold. She was not intimidated. Fear had been a constant companion for so long that it had become a dull, familiar ache. She had been more afraid of Mr. Abernathy's damp, smiling face in Harmony Creek than she was of this grim, silent man. Here, at least, the danger was honest. She focused on her work, on the rhythm of the chores that gave her days shape and purpose. She found a strange sort of peace in the canyon, a freedom in its isolation. There were no whispers here, no judgmental eyes. There was only the wind, the hawks, and the silent man whose grief was so vast it seemed to have soaked into the very logs of the cabin. She did not pity him. Her own sorrow was too fresh for that, but she recognized his pain as a fellow traveler, a citizen of the same desolate country of loss. The first crack in the wall of silence came on a morning sharp with the first real bite of frost. The rocks along the creek bed were slick with a thin, treacherous veneer of ice. Elena, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, had gone to fetch the morning's water. She was careful, her steps measured. But as she leaned down to dip the first wooden bucket into the frigidly clear water, her worn leather sole slipped on a moss-covered stone. Her world tilted. There was a sickening lurch in her stomach, a gasp of air, and the cold, dark water rushing up to meet her. But before she could fall, an iron-hard presence was there. Takakota had been returning from checking his snares, moving with his usual spectral silence. He saw her lose her footing and covered the distance in 2 powerful strides. His hand shot out and clamped around her upper arm, his grip strong and sure, arresting her fall instantly. The shock of the contact was a physical jolt, more startling than the near fall itself. Through the thin wool of her dress, the heat of his hand was a brand. She could feel the power in his grip, the raw strength that could snap a branch or a bone with ease. Yet the pressure was not painful. It was absolute, a human anchor in a world that had just given way. For a heartbeat, they were frozen like that. Elena, off balance, suspended between the rock and the water. Takakota, his body a rigid bulwark against her fall. He looked down at his hand on her arm, a flicker of something unreadable surprised confusion in his dark eyes. He could feel the delicate bones beneath the fabric, the trembling that ran through her. She was not a bundle of chores or an inconvenient presence. She was a living, breathing woman, fragile and warm. The realization was a trespass. He released her as if his hand had caught fire. He took a step back, putting space between them, his face once more an impassive mask. Elena had righted herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. One of the buckets had fallen and was now bobbing away downstream. "Be more careful," he grunted, the first unsolicited words he had spoken to her in a month. Without another glance, he turned and strode back toward the cabin, leaving her staring after him. She stood trembling by the creek, her arm tingling where he had touched her. It was not the cold that made her shiver. The silence that had defined their lives had been broken, not by conversation, but by a single, reflexive act of protection, a silent acknowledgement that her well-being had, on some level, mattered to him. The second crack was deeper, a fissure that split the rock to its core. It happened a week later. Takakota had been tracking a large buck for 2 days, following it high into the treacherous upper reaches of the canyon. The animal was old, wily, and desperate. He finally cornered it on a narrow ledge of crumbling shale. As he drew his bow, the buck charged. He dodged, but his foot slipped on the loose rock. He managed to kill the animal, but not before one of its antlers caught him, ripping a deep, ragged gash in his lower leg, from shin to ankle. The journey back to the cabin was an agony of stubborn pride. Pain was an old acquaintance, and he refused to surrender to it. He dressed the deer where it fell, taking only what he could carry, and began the slow, torturous limp home. Every step sent a bolt of fire up his leg. He felt a dizzying wave of fury at his own weakness, at the betrayal of his own body. He stumbled into the clearing as dusk was settling, the light fading to a soft, bruised purple. He was pale beneath his weathered skin, and a dark, ugly stain was spreading down his buckskin leggings. Elena was outside, securing a loose piece of chinking on the cabin wall. She turned at the sound of his uneven footsteps and saw him. Her eyes widened, taking in his pallor, the grim set of his jaw, the blood. For a moment, she was frozen. He was the strong one, the unassailable mountain. To see him like this wounded, vulnerable, was to see the world shift on its axis. Then, her training, her deeply ingrained instinct to nurture and to heal, took over. She dropped her tools and rushed to his side. "You're hurt," she stated, her voice calm and steady, betraying none of the alarm she felt. "It is nothing," he growled, trying to shove past her toward the cabin door. Pride was the last fortress of a man who had lost everything else. But she stood her ground. She put a firm hand on his chest, stopping him. "It is not nothing. You will bleed out or the wound will fester. Sit." He was about to throw her aside, to rage at her for daring to order him, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, and the world swam before his eyes. He swayed, and in that moment of weakness, he had no choice but to lean on her. He was shocked at the strength in her small frame as she guided him to the stool by the fire, easing him down. "Leave it," he commanded, his voice weak. "No," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. She was no longer the timid employee. She was a caregiver, and her patient was in need. She moved with a quiet, focused urgency. She stoked the fire until it blazed, providing light and heat. She brought a basin of hot water from the pot that always simmered by the hearth, from her personal box. She took clean strips of linen torn from one of her own few petticoats, and a small pouch of dried herbs her mother had taught her to use. With a small, sharp knife, she slit his legging from ankle to knee, exposing the wound. It was worse than she'd thought, a deep, ugly tear in the flesh, filled with dirt and pine needles, still oozing dark blood. Takakota hissed in a sharp breath as the cold air hit it, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. He watched her through a haze of pain as she knelt before him. She worked with a gentle but unwavering confidence. Her touch was light as she began to clean the wound, her fingers probing gently for debris, her expression a mask of concentration. He had prepared himself for the searing pain of the water, but not for the startling intimacy of the act. To be tended to be cared for, it was a language he had long forgotten. He had not allowed another human being to touch him with such gentleness since Nita's hands had been stilled by fever. He watched the firelight play on Elena's dark, bent head, the way she bit her lip in concentration, and a strange, unwelcome warmth spread through his chest, a feeling entirely separate from the fire in his leg. He was being healed, and he hated it, and yet he could not bring himself to pull away. When the wound was clean, she crushed the herbs in her palm, mixing them with a little water to make a paste, and applied it carefully. The poultice stung, but it was a clean, medicinal sting. Then she bound the leg tightly, her movements practiced and sure. She worked in silence, and when she was finished, she stood back, her face smudged, her hands stained with his blood. The air in the cabin was thick with the scent of herbs and the unspoken reality of what had just passed between them. He was in her debt. His survival, for this moment, had depended on her. The carefully constructed dynamic of master and servant had been shattered. He stared at the tightly bound wound, then at her face. He expected to see triumph in her eyes, or perhaps pity. He saw neither. He saw only a deep, somber compassion. He finally looked away, his gaze falling to the dancing flames in the hearth. He felt stripped bare, his defenses breached, his solitude violated in the most profound way. He had chosen this life to avoid connection, to avoid owing anyone anything, to avoid feeling anything. And in one evening, this quiet, stubborn woman had forced all three upon him. The silence stretched, long and taut. He thought she would leave him to his thoughts, retreat back to her own side of the cabin. But she remained standing there, looking at him, at the whole of him, not just the wound. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, a sound that was nearly lost in the crackle of the fire. "You live alone," she said, her words a soft, sad melody. "But you do not have to die alone." The simple sentence landed with the force of a physical blow. It was not an accusation. It was not an offer. It was a statement of a possibility he had never allowed himself to consider. He had equated living alone with dying alone. They were two sides of the same coin of self-preservation. Her words suggested they were separate things, that one did not have to lead to the other, that there was a choice. He did not answer. He couldn't. He simply stared into the fire, his leg throbbing in time with the frantic, terrified beating of his own heart. The lonely Apache had been touched. He had been tended to, and he had been seen. And in the oppressive silence of the canyon, a fragile, terrifying seed of hope had been planted in the barren soil of his soul. Takakota's injury became a chain, binding him to the cabin and to her. For the first week, he could do little more than move from his sleeping pallet to the stool by the fire. The forced inactivity was a torment, a cage for a man who had only ever known the freedom of the mountains. He was a hawk with a broken wing, grounded and restless, forced to watch the world from a single vantage point, and from that vantage point, he watched Elena. Her quiet words, "You do not have to die alone," had echoed in the hollow spaces of his heart, refusing to fade. They had unsettled him more than the injury itself. The pain in his leg was a familiar, physical thing. He could understand it, endure it. This new feeling, this crack in the ice of his soul, was terrifying. The rigid silence that had once governed their lives began to thaw. It was not replaced by conversation. Not at first, but by sound. As Elena worked, she began to hum. It was a low, tuneless sound, a simple melody from a half-forgotten childhood lullaby. The first time he heard it, Takakota's entire body tensed. Sound was an intrusion, a violation of the quiet he had cultivated, but she seemed unaware of his reaction, lost in the rhythm of her work as she ground corn into meal. The humming continued, day after day, becoming as much a part of the cabin's atmosphere as the scent of wood smoke and sage. He found himself listening for it, his anger slowly giving way to a grudging acceptance, and then to something else. The soft, gentle sound was a thread of life stitching the quiet hours together, making the cabin feel less like a tomb. One afternoon, as she was stirring a pot of stew, she laughed. It was not a loud laugh, but a soft, bubbling sound of pure amusement. Takakota, who had been carving a new shaft for an arrow, looked up, startled. He followed her gaze to the doorway, where a fat, audacious ground squirrel was attempting to drag away a dried ear of corn nearly as large as itself, tumbling head over heels with each tug. The sound of her laughter was like water on parched earth. He could not remember the last time he had heard such a sound. A strange, unfamiliar twitch pulled at the corner of his own mouth. It was not quite a smile. but it was the ghost of one, a fossil of a long-dead emotion. The sight of the ridiculous squirrel, combined with the shock of her laughter, had momentarily breached his defenses. When she caught him looking, her laughter died in her throat, a flush rising to her cheeks as she remembered the rules. But he did not scold her. He simply turned back to his carving, the image of her smiling face and the echo of that laugh imprinted on his mind. Her care for his wound was meticulous and impersonal. Yet it was the most intimate contact he'd had in a decade. Every morning and every evening, she would change the dressing. He grew accustomed to the light, sure touch of her fingers against his skin, the clean, herbal scent of her poultice. He told himself it was a necessary chore, nothing more. But he could not deny the flicker of warmth that her proximity ignited. As his leg began to heal, he remained inside, taking on the small tasks he could do while seated. He repaired his traps, sharpened his knives, and mended his leather gear. One evening, as Elena was darning one of his worn buckskin shirts, her fingers stilled. "This is a woman's stitch," she said, her voice quiet. She was looking at a small, neat patch near the collar, sewn with a finer thread than the rest. Takakota's hands, which were wrapping sinew around the base of an arrowhead, stopped. He stared into the fire. "My wife," he said, the words feeling like stones in his throat. "Nita." Her hands were quick. The name hung in the air between them. He had not spoken it aloud in years. Saying it now felt like both a betrayal and a relief. Elena did not press. She simply nodded and continued her own, careful stitches. But a door had been opened. A few nights later, the wind howled outside, a mournful, lonely sound that clawed at the corners of the cabin. The fire was the only light and warmth in a world of shivering darkness. "She was from the White Mountain people," Takakota said suddenly, his voice low. He didn't look at Elena, but he knew she was listening. "Her father was a great leader. I traded 3 fine horses and a rifle for her hand. Her father said he would have given her to me for the horses alone." A faint, sad smile touched his lips. She was strong. Her spirit was like the new grass in spring, soft, but strong enough to push through hard earth. He fell silent, but the story was not over. The dam of his grief, so long held in check, had begun to crumble. Over the next several nights, in pieces, the story of his past emerged. He spoke of his son, Chaitin, a boy with his mother's bright eyes and a laugh that could startle birds from the trees. He described the boy's first successful hunt, a small rabbit caught in a snare, and the immense pride that had swelled in his own chest. He spoke of the coming of the soldiers, of the fighting, of the world being torn apart. But his voice broke when he spoke of the sickness. "It came after the fighting," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the flames, seeing another fire in another time. A cough that turned to fire in the lungs. First the old ones, then the children. He swallowed hard. Chaitin. He was hot with fever for 3 days. Nita held him. She would not let him go. She sang to him. His voice was ragged. He died in her arms. A week later, she followed him. He said nothing more. The cabin was filled with the terrible weight of his loss. Elena's eyes glistened in the firelight, but she did not offer empty words of comfort. She knew, as only someone who has known loss can know, that some sorrows are too vast for words. She simply sat with him in his pain, her silent presence a testament that he was no longer alone with his ghosts. The next day, as he sat outside for the first time, leaning his back against the sun-warmed logs of the cabin, he watched her work. She moved with a grace and economy that reminded him, achingly, of Nita. "You learned to tend wounds from your mother," he stated. It was not a question. Elena paused in her task of scrubbing the stew pot. "Yes," she said. "She learned from her mother. She said that for women like us, on the edge of things, we had to be our own doctors, our own priests, our own everything." "Women like you?" he asked. His curiosity piqued. She looked out over the vast, empty canyon, her expression wistful. My father was an American, a surveyor. He passed through our village in Mexico. He had kind eyes and a laugh my mother loved. She gave a small, sad smile. He promised to come back for her. He never did. We came here, to Harmony Creek, looking for him. But we never found him, and the people there, they never let us forget that we were not one of them. My mother was the Mexican woman. I was the half-breed girl. She spoke without bitterness, with a simple, factual weariness that was more heartbreaking than anger. Takakota listened, and for the first time, he saw her not just as Elena, the woman who cooked his food, but as a fellow outcast. He had been driven into this canyon by the hatred of the white man's world. She had been born into it, an exile in her own land. They were both survivors of a quiet, relentless war. The sky had been a threatening, bruised gray all day. As evening fell, the wind picked up, shrieking like a banshee through the narrow canyon. Then came the snow, not the gentle, drifting flakes of a quiet winter's night, but a driving, blinding wall of white, thrown against the cabin by a furious gale. The world outside disappeared. The temperature plummeted. The wind found every tiny crack in the cabin walls, sending icy fingers of air snaking inside. The fire, their only source of heat, roared and sputtered as the downdraft from the chimney tried to extinguish it. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, and the wooden shutter over the window, weakened by age, tore from one of its leather hinges and crashed inward, bringing a swirl of snow and freezing air into the room. Elena cried out in alarm. Takakota was on his feet in an instant, his healing leg protesting but holding his weight. He grabbed the shutter, fighting against the force of the wind that was trying to rip it from his grasp. The rope he yelled over the roar of the storm. Elena needed no other instruction. She grabbed a length of rope from a peg on the wall and worked with him, her small hands surprisingly strong as they fought to lash the shutter back into place. Snow melted on her hair and face, and the wind tore at her clothes, but she did not falter. Together, they managed to secure it, plunging the cabin back into the dim, flickering light of the fire. They stood for a moment, breathing heavily, their shoulders almost touching. The storm raged outside, a wild beast trying to claw its way in, but inside, they had created a tiny, fragile pocket of safety. "Thank you," he said, the words torn from him by the necessity of the moment. She just nodded, shivering, and retreated to the hearth, holding her hands out to the flames. The cabin felt smaller than ever, their shared space shrinking until it was just the small circle of light cast by the fire. Takakota sat on his stool, closer to the hearth than usual, seeking its warmth. Elena sat on her bedroll, only a few feet away. The storm was a relentless assault on the senses, a constant, deafening roar that made conversation impossible. They sat in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty or hostile. It was a shared silence, a companionship forged in the face of the storm's fury. A log in the fire collapsed, sending a shower of bright orange sparks onto the hearthstones, dangerously close to Elena's bedroll, with a speed that surprised them both. Takakota reached out, grabbing her hand and pulling her away from the sparks. His hand was large and calloused, engulfing hers completely. Her skin was cool from the chill. His was warm from the fire. The contact was electric. It was the second time he had touched her, but this time was different. It was not a reflexive act of rescue, but a conscious, deliberate connection. The sparks died down, but he did not let go. He held her hand, his thumb stroking absently over her knuckles. He could feel the fine bones, the delicate but strong pulse beating steadily beneath her skin. He looked at their joined hands, his dark and weathered, hers slender and pale in the firelight. And in that moment, holding her hand while the world raged outside, Takakota finally understood. He had spent years believing he was strong in his solitude, that his refusal to feel was a shield. He saw now that it was the armor of a coward. He had not been fleeing the weakness of love. He had been fleeing its terrifying, world-shattering power. He was afraid of love not because it was fragile, but because it was the strongest thing in the universe, strong enough to build a world, and strong enough to reduce it to ash when it was gone. To love Nita and Chaitin had been to stand on the sun. To lose them had been to be plunged into the frozen darkness of space. He had been terrified of ever feeling that warmth again, for fear of the inevitable cold. He looked at Elena. She was watching him, her honey-colored eyes wide and luminous in the firelight. She was not asking for anything. She was simply there, sharing the storm, her hand resting in his. Slowly, deliberately, he tightened his grip, a silent acknowledgement, a surrender. The storm could rage all it wanted. It could not get in, not anymore. The long winter of his heart was over. The man who had hired a cook to survive the season had just found a companion to weather the storm. And he knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that nothing would ever be the same. The great storm broke the back of winter. In its wake, the world was remade, scoured clean and draped in a blanket of profound, white silence. The fury of the wind was replaced by a deep, crystalline peace. Inside the cabin, the storm had broken something else, the wall between them. The silence that returned was not the empty, hostile quiet of before, but a shared, comfortable space, warmed by the fire and the unspoken understanding that had been forged in the heart of the tempest. Takakota's hand had remained in hers long after the danger of the sparks had passed. They had sat that way for hours, watching the fire die down to embers as the storm exhausted itself outside. No words were spoken, but everything was said. It was a treaty signed without ink, a vow made without voice. In the days that followed, a new rhythm emerged. The humming returned, and sometimes the soft laughter. But now, it was often met with a low grunt of acknowledgement from Takakota, or the rare, fleeting ghost of a smile. He began to speak more, not in long narratives, but in brief observations about the world outside. He would point out the track of a snowshoe hare, or note the way the wind had sculpted the drifts against the canyon wall. He was sharing his world with her, the one he had inhabited alone for so long. He taught her things. He showed her how to read the signs of the weather in the clouds, how to identify the edible roots that grew even in the hard winter soil. He took a piece of soft pine and, over several evenings, carved a small, smooth bird, its head cocked as if listening. He sanded it with a piece of sandstone until it felt like silk, then pressed it into her hand without a word. The small, wooden bird felt warmer and heavier than any gold. Elena, in turn, brought her own world into the cabin. She told him stories her mother had told her, tales of clever coyotes and stubborn saints from a land of colorful villages and warm sun. She described the taste of mangoes, the scent of night-blooming jasmine, the sound of guitars playing in a plaza on a summer evening. She was painting a picture of a life he had never known, filling the Spartan cabin with the colors of her memory. They were no longer master and servant. They were not even quite friends. They were two solitary stars that had drifted into the same orbit, held there by a gravity they did not yet have a name for. The end of their contract, the coming of the spring thaw, was an unspoken truth that hung between them, a cloud on the horizon of their newfound peace. As the snow began to melt, receding first from the sun-facing slopes, the land reawakened. The creek, which had been a frozen trickle, swelled into a gurgling, energetic torrent, and their supplies, stretched thin by the long winter, began to run low. The flour sack was nearly empty, the coffee tin held only dust, and the salt was a few precious crystals at the bottom of a wooden box. "We need supplies," Takakota stated one evening, his voice flat, but the words carried an immense weight. It meant leaving their sanctuary. It meant returning to the world of men. It meant going to Harmony Creek. Elena felt a knot of cold dread form in her stomach. The canyon had become her home, its isolation a protective embrace. The thought of facing the whispers and the cold, judging eyes of the townspeople made her physically ill. She had almost forgotten that other world existed. Takakota saw the fear in her eyes. "I will go alone," he said. "No," she replied, her voice firmer than she expected. The woman who had arrived in this canyon months ago would have agreed meekly. This woman was different. "You cannot carry everything yourself. Your leg is strong, but not that strong. And I will not stay here alone." The thought of being in the cabin without him was, she realized with a jolt, more frightening than facing Harmony Creek with him. He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. The journey down from the canyon 2 days later was a stark contrast to her lonely, desperate trek up. This time, she did not walk behind the mule. She walked beside Takakota. He adjusted his long, ground-eating stride to match hers. A small, unconscious courtesy that spoke volumes. The world felt different. The sky seemed bluer, the air cleaner. They moved as a team, a silent, efficient unit. And for the first time since her mother's death, Elena did not feel entirely alone in the world. But as the jagged silhouette of the canyon walls gave way to the flat, dusty expanse of the plains, the feeling of peace began to evaporate, replaced by a tense, prickling apprehension. Harmony Creek appeared on the horizon, a smudge of ugly, angular buildings under the vast, indifferent sky. It did not look like a place of harmony. It looked like a wound on the face of the land. Their arrival was met with a sudden, conspicuous silence. A man who had been sweeping the porch of the saloon stopped, his broom frozen mid-air. 2 women gossiping outside the dress shop fell quiet, their eyes wide, their hands flying to their mouths to conceal their whispers. A group of children playing in the dusty street scattered like quail. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. They were a spectacle. The reclusive, dangerous Apache, and the girl who had disappeared into the mountains with him months ago. Elena could feel their stares like physical blows. She could hear the word that was on all their lips, even if they didn't speak it aloud. Asterisk. His asterisk woman. The Apache's woman. She pulled her shawl tighter, her gaze fixed on the ground in front of her, her face burning with a shame she did not deserve. Takakota seemed oblivious, his expression as impassive as ever. But Elena, who had learned to read the subtle shifts in his posture, saw the way his shoulders had tensed, the way his hand now rested near the hilt of the long knife at his belt. He was a coiled spring, a predator walking through a field of nervous prey. Abernathy's general store was just as she remembered it, a cluttered space smelling of sawdust, pickles, and chewing tobacco. Mr. Abernathy himself was behind the counter, a portly man with a shiny bald head and small, shrewd eyes. When he saw them enter, his face went through a rapid series of expressions: surprise, then a flicker of possessive anger as he looked at Elena, and finally, a mask of greasy, professional courtesy as his eyes landed on the thick stack of prime winter pelts Takakota carried. "Well, well," Abernathy said, his voice unctuous. "Look what the spring thaw washed down. Come to trade. Have you—" "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition," Takakota said, his voice a low rumble. He dropped the pelts on the counter. The heavy thud seemed to make the whole store tremble. While the 2 men began the silent, tense ritual of haggling, Abernathy inspecting each pelt, Takakota watching his every move with narrowed eyes. Elena moved through the store, gathering the items they needed. She tried to make herself invisible, to ignore the presence of the 2 other men in the store, a pair of grimy ranch hands who were loafing by the Cracker Barrel. She recognized them from before Cletus and Boone. They were watching her, their eyes undressing her, their mouths twisted into ugly, suggestive smirks. "Looky there, Boone," Cletus said, his voice a loud, carrying drawl meant for everyone to hear. She's looking a mite healthier than when she left. Mountain air must agree with her. Or maybe it's the company she's keeping, Boone snickered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that landed dangerously close to her skirt. Elena's blood ran cold. She kept her back to them, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted a sack of flour. Takakota and Abernathy continued their trade, either not hearing or choosing to ignore the comments. She moved to the far side of the store, pretending to inspect a bolt of cloth. She just needed to get their things and leave. But they followed her. She could smell the sour scent of whiskey and unwashed bodies as they closed in, cutting off her retreat. "So, tell us, little lady," Cletus said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial leer. "What's it like, playing house with a redskin? He treat you right?" Before she could answer, before she could even breathe, his hand shot out and grabbed her arm. His grip was rough and tight, his fingers digging into her flesh. "You ain't too good to talk to your own kind, are you?" The store went silent. The soft sound of a dust mote dancing in a sunbeam would have been deafening. Takakota had been facing the counter, his back to the room. He did not turn around, not at first. He simply went still. The air around him seemed to drop 20 degrees. Abernathy, who had been holding up a fox pelt, slowly lowered it, his face pale. Then Takakota turned. He moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, not the jerky movements of an angry man, but the deliberate, fluid motion of a striking snake. His face was devoid of all expression, which was far more frightening than any rage. His eyes, however, were not empty. They burned with a black, bottomless fire, a promise of swift and terrible annihilation. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sound that emerged from his throat was low, guttural, a sound from the dawn of time, the sound of a predator claiming its territory. "Touch her," he said, the words perfectly clear, perfectly calm, and utterly lethal, "and you will not leave this place." It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, as undeniable as the rising of the sun. Cletus's smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed look of pure, animal terror. He was looking into the eyes of a man who had seen death, who had dealt death, and who would not hesitate to do so again. Slowly, as if his hand were made of glass, he released Elena's arm. Takakota took one step forward. Cletus and Boone stumbled backward, tripping over each other in their haste to get away. They scrambled out the door of the store and disappeared. Takakota's gaze then fell on Abernathy, who looked as if he might faint, without another word. Takakota gestured to the pile of supplies Elena had gathered. Abernathy, his hands shaking, quickly finished the transaction, giving Takakota a far more generous trade than he had intended. The journey back to the canyon was made in a new kind of silence. Elena walked beside him, her mind a whirlwind. She could still feel the phantom grip of Cletus's fingers on her arm, the remembered shame of his words. The fear was a cold, hard stone in her stomach. But as they walked, another feeling began to rise, a great, swelling tide of understanding that was so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. She looked at Takakota's profile as he walked, his face set like the mountains around them. He had done more than just protect her. In that store, in front of the whole town, he had drawn a line in the sand. On one side was the hostile, hating world. On the other side was her, and he had chosen to stand with her. He had not done it because he had hired her. He had not done it out of a sense of obligation. He had done it because the thought of another man laying a hand on her was something he could not, would not, tolerate. He had risked everything: a fight, jail, a hanging for her. The rumors and the hatred of the town suddenly seemed small and insignificant. Let them whisper. Let them hate. Their judgment meant nothing. What mattered was the truth she now saw with blinding clarity. His actions in the store were a louder declaration than any pretty words could ever be. He had been hired only to cook, she thought, her heart aching with a fierce, protective tenderness. She had come to his cabin seeking only shelter, but in that cold, lonely place. They had found something else entirely. He hadn't just given her a job. He had, in that single, violent, protective moment, placed his scarred and broken heart directly into her hands. The peace that settled over the canyon in the week after their return to Harmony Creek was a different kind of peace. It was not the quiet of solitude, but the charged stillness before a storm. The ugly encounter in the general store had been a stone thrown into a still pond, and the ripples were spreading outward, invisible but powerful. They both felt it. Takakota became even more watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgeline, his senses tuned to the slightest unnatural sound. Elena found herself starting at the snap of a twig or the cry of a distant coyote. The canyon was no longer just a sanctuary. It was a fortress, and they were its sole defenders. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had changed as well. The space between them, once a chasm of silence and then a bridge of tentative understanding, had now become a circle of mutual protection. When he cleaned his rifle by the firelight, his movements precise and deadly, she understood he was not just tending to a tool. He was sharpening a promise. When she stitched a tear in his sleeve, her motions calm and steady, it was an act of faith, a quiet declaration that they would face whatever was coming, together. The world outside the cabin was no longer an abstract threat. It had names: Cletus, Boone, Abernathy. It had a face contorted by hate and ignorance. They had looked into its eyes and it had looked back, and neither had flinched. But they knew it was not over. Hatred, like a cornered animal, is most dangerous when its pride has been wounded. The attack came on a moonless night. The stars were a cold, indifferent glitter in a black velvet sky. A low mist clung to the creek bed, muffling the familiar night sounds and creating a world of shifting, ghostly shapes. Inside the cabin, a single candle and the low embers of the fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Elena was mending a flour sack, her head bent over her work. Takakota sat on his stool, polishing the blade of his hunting knife with a piece of oiled leather. The only sounds were the soft whisper of leather on steel and the gentle crackle of the dying fire. It was Takakota who heard it first. His hands stilled, his head lifted, his body going rigid, his focus directed not at the door, but at the very air itself. He was listening to something beyond the range of normal hearing a vibration, a disturbance in the deep rhythm of the canyon night. "What is it?" Elena whispered, her own heart beginning to beat faster at the sudden tension in him. He put a finger to his lips, his eyes narrowed. He rose, silent as smoke, and moved to the heavy wooden bar that secured the door, lifting it into its brackets with a soft, solid thud. He then went to the small, shuttered window and opened it just a crack, peering out into the darkness. Elena held her breath. She could hear nothing but the wind and the faint gurgle of the creek. Then she saw it, a flicker of orange light, gone as soon as it appeared, reflected for a bare second in Takakota's dark eye. "Get the rifle," he said, his voice a low, calm whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "And stay away from the door." Her hands trembled as she took the heavy rifle down from its pegs over the hearth. The cold weight of the steel was a terrible reality. This was not a story. This was not a bad dream. The hatred of Harmony Creek had followed them home. Now she could hear them, the crunch of boots on the gravel of the creek bed, the low, guttural sound of men trying and failing to be quiet. Then, the light again, brighter this time. A torch, then another, and another. A cluster of angry firefly lights emerged from the mist, bobbing and weaving as they approached the clearing. They were a pack of wolves, their courage bolstered by whiskey and numbers. Elena could make out 6, maybe 7 figures. They carried rifles, shotguns, and the burning torches that painted their faces in demonic shades of orange and black. She recognized the swaggering gait of Cletus and the hulking shape of Boone. The others were faces she'd seen lounging in the saloon, men with dead eyes and mean, thin mouths. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their bravado momentarily checked by the dark, silent cabin. It was an unnerving sight, a black void that seemed to swallow the light of their torches. Takakota Cletus yelled, his voice slurred but loud, shattering the canyon's peace. "We know you're in there, and we know you've got that girl with you." There was no answer from the cabin. "We're here for her," another voice shouted. "We ain't gonna let no decent woman be held captive by the likes of you." The hypocrisy of the words was a bitter poison in Elena's throat. Decent woman. They had never once looked at her as a decent woman. They had looked at her as an object, a half-breed, something to be used or discarded, and now they were her saviors. "Send her out!" Apache Cletus roared, taking a step forward. "Send her out now, and we might just let you live." Inside, Takakota turned his gaze from the window to Elena. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. "Stay here," he commanded in a low voice. He picked up his own rifle, checked the load, and moved toward the door. "No," Elena said, her voice shaking but resolute. She stood up, the rifle heavy in her hands. "They are here because of me. I will not hide behind you." A flicker of surprise, of fierce pride, lit his eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her at the determined set of her jaw, the fear in her eyes warring with a strength she had not known she possessed. He gave a single, sharp nod. He lifted the bar from the door and pulled it open. He did not step out immediately, but stood in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette framed by the faint firelight from within. The effect was immediate. The mob fell silent, their drunken jeers dying in their throats. Takakota stepped out into the clearing, his rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. He was not aiming at them, which was somehow more menacing. It suggested a confidence, a deep-seated certainty that he did not yet need to. Then, to the astonishment of the men, Elena stepped out and stood beside him. She held her own rifle, its barrel likewise pointed down, but her grip was firm. Cletus stared, his whiskey-addled brain struggling to process the scene. This was not how it was supposed to happen. The girl was supposed to be a cowering victim, waiting for rescue. She was not supposed to be standing beside the beast, armed, her expression one of defiant solidarity. "Elena, honey," Cletus said, trying for a wheedling, concerned tone. "You can come on out now. You're safe. We've come to take you home." "I am home," Elena said, her voice ringing out in the cold night air, clear and strong as a bell. The sound of her own courage surprised her. "Now, honey, you don't mean that," Boone grunted, shifting his shotgun nervously. "He's got you spooked is all. He's filled your head with lies." "The only lies I have heard have been in the town you came from," she replied, her gaze sweeping over their faces, seeing not saviors, but the same ignorant malice she had seen in the general store. "The only danger I have known is from men like you." This was too much for them. Their thin veneer of chivalry evaporated, revealing the raw prejudice beneath. "She's bewitched," one of the men yelled. "That Apache devil has put a spell on her. She's his property now. Is that it?" Cletus sneered, his face twisting into an ugly mask. "You think because you kept her all winter? She belongs to you. We've come to take back what's ours." At that, Takakota took a slow step forward. The torchlight glinted off the barrel of his rifle. He still did not raise it. He simply looked at them, his gaze moving from one man to the next, a predator assessing a threat. "She does not belong to me," he said, his voice as low and dangerous as a distant rock slide. "And she does not belong to you." He took another deliberate step. "You speak of her as if she is a horse to be traded, a sack of flour to be claimed. You look at her, and you see nothing. I look at her, and I see a heart stronger than any man in this canyon." He stopped, his eyes finally locking onto Cletus. "She made a choice to be here, a choice you are too small to understand." He let the words hang in the air for a moment. "Now, You will make a choice. You will turn around. You will walk out of my canyon, and you will never come back. Cletus, emboldened by the 6 men behind him, laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Or what? Apache, you gonna take us all on by yourself? There's 7 of us and 1 of you. 2, Elena said firmly, taking a step forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with Takakota, raising the barrel of her rifle a few inches. Takakota's lips pulled back from his teeth in a smile that held no warmth, no humor. It was a terrifying, feral sight. You are right, he said softly. I am 1 man, but you are not in the town square. You are not in your saloon. You are in my home. His voice dropped even lower, a sound that seemed to be drawn from the earth beneath their feet. Here, I am not just a man. I am the shadow that moves in the corner of your eye. I am the stone that turns under your foot and sends you falling. I am the silence that comes before the scream. He raised his free hand and pointed a single, steady finger at Cletus. You came here with fire. If you force me to answer you, the only fire you will see is the one that burns in your own homesteads. Set by a ghost you will never find. I will not hunt you like men. I will hunt you like rabbits. I will take your horses in the night. I will spoil your water. Your children will wake up crying from dreams of a dark face in their window. He paused, letting the images sink in. You will live every day of your short, miserable lives looking over your shoulder, and you will die in fear, alone in the dark. Now, for the last time, leave. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind had died. The creek seemed to have stopped running. The only sound was the crackle and spit of their torches. The men looked at each other, their drunken courage shriveling in the face of such a cold, elemental promise. They had come to fight an Indian. They found themselves facing a force of nature. They saw in Takakota's eyes not the possibility of a fight, but the certainty of a curse. He would not just kill them, he would unmake their entire world. Cletus swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked from Takakota's burning eyes to Elena's unwavering stance. Their narrative was shattered. Their enemy was united. Their courage was gone. Let's go, he muttered, not looking at anyone. Slowly, hesitantly. The mob began to disintegrate. They backed away, their torches held low, their eyes still fixed on the 2 figures who stood unmoving before the dark cabin. They turned and stumbled back the way they came, their retreat a shambling, pathetic affair. Their angry shouts were replaced by the sound of their own shuffling, cowardly feet. Takakota and Elena stood side by side, watching until the last flicker of torchlight had been swallowed by the mist and the darkness. They stood for a long time after, listening until the last echo of their departure had faded, leaving only the familiar, peaceful sounds of the canyon night. The danger had passed. The greatest test of their lives was over. They had faced down their pasts. They had faced down society, and they were still standing. Slowly, Elena lowered her rifle, her arms trembling from the strain. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its place. She looked at Takakota. He was looking at her, his expression one of awe, of wonder, of a love so fierce and powerful it needed no words. This was their truth. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was not about a contract or a bargain. Their love had been forged in silence and solitude, tested by prejudice. And tonight, it had been sanctified by fire, in the heart of the dark and unforgiving West, in a small cabin nestled in a lonely canyon. They had built a kingdom for 2, and they had just proven they would defend it to the death. They did not go back inside immediately. They stood in the cold, clean air of the clearing, the twin pillars of a world they had just defended. The silence that rushed back in to fill the void left by the mob was a living thing, a balm on their raw nerves. It was the ancient, sacred silence of the canyon, and it was theirs once more, slowly, as if moving in a dream. Takakota reached out and took the heavy rifle from Elena's hands. His fingers brushed against hers, and the brief contact was a spark of life in the cold aftermath. He leaned both rifles against the cabin wall and turned back to her. In the faint starlight, he could see the tracks of tears on her dusty cheeks. Tears she had shed without making a sound. He saw the trembling in her shoulders that she was trying so desperately to control. He saw the fierce, beautiful courage in her eyes that had faced down 7 armed men. A wave of emotion so powerful, it threatened to pull him under a mixture of awe, fierce protectiveness, and a tenderness that ached in his chest rose within him. He lifted a hand, his calloused, scarred fingers hesitant for a moment before they came to rest gently on her cheek. He brushed away a tear with his thumb. The gesture was infinitely gentle, a stark contrast to the violence he had promised their tormentors. "You were not afraid," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. It was not a question, but a statement of wonder. Elena let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She confessed, her voice barely audible. "I was terrified, but I was more afraid of losing this." Her gaze swept around the dark clearing, the silent cabin, and came to rest on his face. "Of losing you." The admission hung between them, simple, honest, and more devastating than any threat or weapon. He had spent a decade building walls to keep the world out, to keep feeling out, and this woman, with her quiet strength and her steadfast heart, had not broken them down. She had simply walked through them as if they were never there. He slid his hand from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in the soft hair at her nape. He drew her forward until her forehead rested against his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart beneath her ear, a rhythm as constant and reassuring as the turning of the seasons. She closed her eyes, inhaling the scent of pine smoke, leather, and the unique, earthy scent that was his alone. She wrapped her arms around his waist, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. He held her like that for a long time, his large hand a warm, protective weight on her head, his other arm wrapped securely around her back. He was shielding her from the memory of what had just happened, from the hatred of the world, from everything. In his embrace, she was not the half-breed girl, not the Apache's woman, not an outcast. She was simply Elena, and she was safe. Finally, the deep chill of the night began to seep into their bones. "Come," he said softly, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Inside, by the fire, he released her slowly, reluctantly, and they went back into the cabin. The simple act of barring the door behind them feeling like a sacred ritual. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing, orange embers. Takakota added several logs, and soon the flames leaped up again, chasing the shadows into the corners and filling the small space with a dancing, golden light. They sat, not in their usual separate spaces, but together on the thick bearskin rug before the hearth. The heat from the fire warmed their faces, but a different kind of warmth was spreading between them. The night's events had been a crucible, a trial by fire that had burned away everything that was not essential. All that was left was a stark, undeniable truth. The world outside would not change. The men would go back to Harmony Creek and their story would curdle into a local legend, a tale of the bewitched girl and the savage Apache who held her in his thrall. The prejudice would remain, a poison in the well. But here, in this cabin, that fact no longer mattered. The judgment of the world was a distant, irrelevant noise. Their reality was the warmth of the fire, the strength of the log walls, and the quiet, profound connection that bound them together. This was their Chong-go, their shared enlightenment. The world's hatred had not divided them. It had fused them into a single, unbreakable whole. Elena looked at Takakota. He was staring into the flames, his profile etched by the firelight. The harsh lines of his face seemed softer now, the perpetual grief in his eyes replaced by a deep, thoughtful stillness. The spring thaw had come, and with it, the end of their original agreement. She had fulfilled her contract. She was free to go. The thought was a cold, hollow ache. Leaving this place, leaving him, was no longer a possibility. It was an amputation. She had to speak the truth aloud, to give it voice and make it real, to ensure there were no more shadows of misunderstanding between them. "The snows have melted," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Our arrangement is over. I have enough from the trade to find a place in another town, somewhere far from here." Takakota turned his head to look at her. The stillness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a storm of emotions he could no longer hide. Fear, hope, a desperate, unspoken plea. He thought she was telling him she was leaving. The warrior who had faced down 7 men without a tremor looked, in that moment, utterly terrified. Seeing the raw vulnerability in his face gave her the last ounce of courage she needed. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "I will not be going," she said. She took a deep breath, gathering all the truth in her heart. "I want you to understand. I do not stay because I'm afraid of the world outside. I do not stay because I have nowhere else to go." She looked directly into his eyes, her own shining with a clear, unwavering light. "I do not stay because I must. I stay because I love you." The words, spoken so simply, so directly, landed in the quiet room with the force of a thunderclap. It was a truth so pure and powerful it seemed to shimmer in the air between them. Takakota stared at her, his lips parted slightly, his breath caught in his throat. He had been so certain that love was a thing of the past, a ghost that belonged to a younger, more foolish man. He had believed his heart was a dead thing, a barren field of ash and memory. But this woman, with her quiet resilience and her immense courage, had planted a seed in that barren field, and now, against all odds, it had bloomed. He felt the sting of tears behind his eyes, an unfamiliar, burning sensation. His throat felt thick, choked with a decade of unspoken grief and a lifetime of unspent love. He reached up and touched her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw as if she were a miraculous vision he feared might disappear. His voice, when he finally found it, was a raw, strangled whisper, thick with an emotion so profound it was painful. "She was hired only to cook," he murmured, his gaze holding hers, his words a confession, a prayer, a revelation spoken to the universe. But the lonely Apache found something he never expected. He swallowed, the words catching in his throat. Love. The last word was a sigh, a surrender, the final lowering of a shield he had carried for a lifetime. He leaned in, his eyes never leaving hers, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She leaned toward him, meeting him halfway. He closed the distance between them, and his lips met hers. It was not a kiss of frantic passion or desperate need. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was slow, deep, and profoundly gentle. It was a kiss of reverence, of gratitude, of 2 solitudes finally, blessedly, coming to an end. His lips were firm but soft, tasting of wood smoke and the cold night air. Her lips were a warm, yielding promise. He slid his hand from her face to the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her braid, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in creation. Her own hands came up to frame his face, her thumbs stroking the weathered skin of his cheeks. They stayed like that for a long, timeless moment, the world reduced to the circle of firelight and the tender, miraculous geography of their kiss. It was a silent vow, a treaty signed in the heart of the wilderness. It was the healing of 2 broken souls, the joining of 2 disparate worlds. It was the first kiss of the rest of their lives. When they finally drew apart, they rested their foreheads together, their breath mingling in the cool air. The stars had wheeled across the sky, a silent, glittering audience to their pledge. Takakota was no longer the lonely Apache. Eliana was no longer the outcast girl. They were the beginning of a new story, a new people, a new world, born not in a church or a courthouse, but under a canopy of desert stars, sanctified by the fire in their own hearts. The kiss under the stars was not an ending, but a beginning. It was the first sentence of a new chapter, written in a language that had no need for words. When they woke the next morning, the world was the same, yet entirely different. The sunlight that spilled over the canyon rim seemed warmer. The song of the creek sounded sweeter, and the very air within the cabin felt lighter, charged with a quiet, joyful energy. The ghosts of the past had not vanished, but they had retreated, their mournful whispers replaced by the steady, living sound of two hearts beating in the same small space. Their life together began to grow, organically and beautifully, like a vine finding its way toward the sun. The cabin, once a Spartan shelter built for the singular purpose of survival, slowly began to transform into a home. The change started in small ways. Elena found a sunny, protected patch of earth near the creek where the soil was rich and dark, with a pointed stick for a trowel in her bare hands. She began to cultivate a garden. Takakota watched her at first, a silent observer, as she carefully planted the handful of beans and squash seeds she had saved from their supplies. Then, one morning, he appeared beside her, holding a sturdy, spade-like tool he had fashioned from the shoulder bone of a deer. He didn't say a word, simply handed it to her and then began to clear the larger rocks from the patch, his powerful muscles making short work of the task. They worked side by side, a team, turning the wild earth into a promise of sustenance. Elena began to bring the life of the canyon inside. She would return from her walks with her apron full of wild herbs and flowers. Bundles of sage, chamomile, and mint soon hung from the rafters, drying in the warm air, and filling the cabin with a complex, fragrant perfume that mingled with the familiar scent of wood smoke. She found a patch of brightly colored clay by the creek and, remembering a skill her mother had taught her, she fashioned two simple, beautiful cups, which she hardened by the fire, drinking coffee from them. A warmth spread through Takakota that had nothing to do with the heat of the drink. It was the warmth of a life being built, not just endured. In turn, Takakota began to share the soul of his world. The warrior who had walled himself off from all softness and beauty rediscovered the artist within. His knife, once only a tool for hunting and defense, became a tool of creation. He would sit for hours by the fire, a piece of cottonwood or pine in his hands, and the shavings would fall away to reveal a shape, a story. He carved her a smooth, elegant comb for her long dark hair, its handle shaped like a hawk in flight. He carved a set of bowls, each one decorated with a different pattern, one for the rain, one for the sun, one for the river. He began to tell her the old stories, the ones he had not allowed himself to remember for a decade. He spoke of the creation of the world, of the first people who emerged from the earth. He told her tales of Coyote, the clever trickster, and of White-Painted Woman, whose strength and wisdom guided his people. As he spoke, his face would transform. The hard, stoic mask would fall away, and she would see the young man he had once been, his eyes alive with the fire of his heritage. He was not just sharing stories. He was giving her the keys to his soul, entrusting her with a sacred history that the world outside had tried so hard to extinguish. He taught her words in his Chiricahua tongue, and her soft accent as she tried to pronounce them was a sweeter music than he had ever known. One afternoon, he led her to a quiet, secluded spot on a high ledge overlooking the canyon. Two simple mounds of stone lay under the shade of a twisted, ancient juniper tree. It was the resting place of Nita and Chaitan. Elena stood beside him, her heart aching for the immense loss he had carried alone for so long. He did not speak of the sickness or the sorrow. Instead, he pointed to the sky. "When a great warrior dies," he said, his voice soft, "their spirit becomes a star. You see that one?" He pointed to a bright, unwavering point of light that was just beginning to appear in the twilight sky. "That is Chaitan. He is watching. He is not sad anymore. He then looked at her, his eyes clear and full of a deep, abiding peace she had never seen in them before. He is happy, because his father is not alone. Elena's eyes filled with tears, not of pity, but of understanding. She slid her hand into his, her fingers lacing with his. Their love did not erase his grief. It did not fill the hole that the loss of his family had left in his heart. Instead, their love had built a home around that sacred, empty space, protecting it, honoring it. She understood the profound message. Then love was not an escape from suffering. It was the courage to embrace it, to carry it, and to still find a reason to welcome the sunrise. The world beyond their small valley still existed. They knew this. Sometimes they would see a dust trail on the distant plains, or find the tracks of a shod horse far down the canyon trail, a reminder of the world that had rejected them. But the fear was gone. The hatred of Harmony Creek was like a story from another lifetime. It could not touch them here. They had faced it, and in doing so, had robbed it of its power. Their bond, forged in defiance of a world that said they could not, should not, be together, was their shield. They were a testament to a truth greater than any prejudice, that the color of a person's skin or the language of their ancestors was nothing compared to the language of a human heart speaking to another. Their life was hard. It was a constant negotiation with the unforgiving land. But it was a life of profound richness and meaning. It was in the shared meal at the end of a long day, in the comfortable silence as they sat before the fire, in the touch of a hand in the middle of the night. It was a life built not on possessions, but on presence. The sun was setting, bleeding crimson and gold over the red rock walls, painting the canyon in the same fiery colors as it had on the day she first arrived. But the scene was no longer one of lonely desolation. Takakota sat on the stool outside the cabin door, the familiar place where he had once nursed his solitary grief. But now, he was not alone. He was carving a small, intricate figure of a woman tending a garden. Beside him, sitting on a smooth, flat rock, was Elena. She was weaving a basket from willow branches, her fingers moving with a graceful, practiced rhythm. The light caught the hawk-shaped comb in her hair. A cool breeze whispered down the canyon, carrying the scent of her herbs and the promise of a peaceful night. The world outside was still full of danger and uncertainty. The future was unwritten, a trail leading into an unknown wilderness. But within the small circle of light that would soon bloom from their cabin window, there was everything that mattered. There was a crackling fire. There was love. And there was hope. The lonely Apache was no longer lonely. The outcast girl was no longer an outcast. In each other, against all odds, in the deep and silent heart of the Wild West, they had finally, truly found their family. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting the hype button. We appreciate you all.